There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a hospital hallway when you already know, somehow, that the news is bad before anyone has said a single word to you directly. I felt that silence the moment I saw my husband's face in the doorway of my doctor's office, not mine, his, because apparently that was the order things happened in our marriage now. He had gotten there first. He had heard the results before I had, and by the look on his face, he had already decided what they meant for both of us. I didn't find out what was actually wrong with me that day. I found out, instead, what I was worth. That night, at a dinner I hadn't been consulted about, surrounded by his mother's china and his sister's carefully sympathetic eyes, I listened to my own husband tell his family that I was too sick to be worth the trouble anymore. Nobody looked at me while he said it. Nobody asked me how I felt, what the doctor had actually told me, whether I even wanted this conversation happening over a pot roast instead of in the privacy of our own home. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and I said nothing, because some part of me, the part that had spent 11 years learning exactly how far his patience stretched, already understood that arguing wouldn't change a single mind at that table. 3 days later, the papers arrived. He hadn't waited. He hadn't even pretended to wait. I signed nothing that week. I said almost nothing that week. I simply drove to the hospital administrator's office and asked, calmly, for a complete copy of my own medical file, every page, every result, every note. What I found inside that folder had nothing to do with the story my husband had told his entire family. My name is Renata, and for 11 years I believed that marriage meant showing up for someone even when showing up cost you something. I had built an entire personality around that belief. I was the wife who remembered his mother's medication schedule better than his mother did. I was the wife who kept the family calendar, who remembered every anniversary and every allergy, and every small, quiet preference my husband Walter had never once had to voice out loud, because I had already anticipated it. I told myself, for 11 years, that this kind of attentiveness was love. It took me a long time to understand it had simply been training myself to be indispensable in the hope that indispensable women don't get discarded. I found out I was wrong on a Tuesday in March, in a doctor's waiting room, watching my husband walk out of Dr. Ferris's office 15 minutes before I was called in for my own results. I hadn't thought anything of it at first. Walter had always liked to handle things, as he called it. He'd handled the mortgage refinancing without asking my opinion, handled which neighborhood we'd moved to when his firm relocated, handled the decision to skip having children for the first 6 years of our marriage because, in his words, the timing was never quite right. I had let him handle things because it was easier than fighting for a say. I wasn't sure he'd actually give me. So when I saw him coming out of Dr. Ferris's office ahead of my own appointment, I told myself he'd simply stopped by to ask a quick question, the way he sometimes did, being a man who liked information delivered efficiently, second-hand, filtered through someone else's summary rather than sitting through the details himself. It wasn't until I was sitting across from Dr. Ferris myself, 15 minutes later, that I understood what had actually happened. She was careful with me, overly careful, in a way that made the hair on my arms rise before she'd said anything specific at all. She kept glancing at a note in my file that I couldn't read upside down, and she kept saying things like, "As I mentioned to your husband," and "since Walter already has some context," until I finally raised my hand, the way I imagine a student might, in a classroom where the teacher has clearly skipped ahead without them. "I'm sorry," I said, and I remember my voice coming out steadier than I expected. "You spoke to my husband about my results before you spoke to me." Dr. Ferris's pause told me everything her explanation afterward tried to soften. Walter had called ahead. Walter had explained that he handled the family's medical matters, that I got anxious with numbers and statistics, that it would be easier on everyone if he heard the preliminary findings first and helped translate them for me gently. Dr. Ferris, to her credit, looked uncomfortable admitting it. She told me it wasn't standard practice, that she'd made an exception because Walter had been so insistent, so convincing, and she apologized in the careful language of someone who suspected, too late, that she'd made a mistake she couldn't take back. I don't fully remember the rest of that appointment. I remember words like, further testing, and not conclusive yet, and we'll know more within the month. I remember driving home with both hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, the way my father had taught me decades earlier, because it gave my hands something correct to do, while the rest of me tried to catch up to what had just happened. I remember walking into my own kitchen that evening and finding it already full of people. Walter's mother, Walter's sister, Denise, and her husband. A pot roast I hadn't made, in a dish I didn't recognize, sitting in the center of a table set for 6. "We wanted to be here for you," Walter's mother said, reaching for my hand with an expression that looked almost like sympathy, except that no one had yet told me, formally, out loud, in my own words, what exactly I was supposed to be needing comfort for. I sat down, I unfolded my napkin, and I listened to my husband begin explaining my own diagnosis to a room full of people who knew more about it, at that moment, than I did. Walter spoke about my body the way he spoke about quarterly reports, organized, efficient, faintly detached, as though the woman the numbers belonged to wasn't sitting 18 inches to his left with her napkin folded neatly in her lap. He used words like concerning and aggressive potential, and we're preparing for every outcome, and I remember watching his mother's face soften with something that looked almost like relief, as if her son, handling this crisis competently, was itself the comfort she'd come for. Nobody asked me how I felt hearing my own possible diagnosis spoken about in the third person. Nobody asked me what Dr. Ferris had actually said, word for word, or whether Walter's summary matched it. I sat very still, and I watched my husband's hands, steady, folded on the table, a man in complete control of a narrative that happened to be about my body, and I felt something in me go quiet, in a way I didn't yet have a name for. It was Denise who finally said the thing that made the whole table stop, pretending this was a conversation about logistics. "Well," she said, reaching for the wine, "I suppose the silver lining is you two never had kids. One less thing to worry about managing right now." I remember a small, sharp silence following that sentence, the kind of silence that exists because everyone in the room understands they've just heard something cruel, and no one wants to be the one who says so out loud. Walter didn't correct her. Walter's mother made a soft, non-committal sound and reached for the pot roast. And I sat there, 11 years of careful, practiced composure, the only thing standing between me and saying something I couldn't take back at my own dinner table. Then Walter said the sentence that ended, quietly and permanently, whatever version of our marriage I had still been holding on to. "I think," he said, not looking at me, looking instead at his mother, as though she were the one whose opinion mattered in this particular accounting, "we have to be honest that this changes the shape of things going forward. I didn't sign up to spend the next however many years managing a sick wife. I think everyone here can understand that. Too sick to be worth the trouble anymore." He didn't use those exact words that night. Those came 3 days later, secondhand, through his sister, who apparently felt it was her responsibility to relay to me, almost gently, what Walter had said to a friend at his office the following afternoon, as though she thought I deserved to hear it from someone who cared about me, rather than reading it in a legal document. But the meaning was already sitting on that table in March, dressed up in softer language, wrapped in a pot roast none of us finished. I didn't cry at that dinner. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a woman in my position to have cried, to have thrown a glass, to have said something they could later describe as quite a scene. I didn't do any of that. I sat with my hands folded and I finished my meal, slowly, deliberately, because some old, stubborn part of me refused to give that table the satisfaction of watching me come apart in real time. I excused myself once dessert was served, said I had a headache, and drove home ahead of Walter, who stayed behind, I assume, to receive more comfort for the burden he'd just described to his family. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop open, searching, at 2 a.m., for exactly what rights a patient has over her own medical information, and exactly how quickly a hospital is required to produce a complete file when a patient requests one directly. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even angry. Not yet. It was simply the plan of a woman who had spent 11 years learning to anticipate everyone else's needs, finally turning that same careful attention toward her own. 3 days later, the divorce papers arrived by courier, before I'd even finished my coffee. And that same afternoon, I sat in the hospital administrator's office, watching a woman named Patricia print out my complete file, page by page, and slid it across the desk toward me, in a manila folder, considerably thicker than I had expected it to be. Patricia was not a woman inclined toward small talk, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. She had the brisk, unhurried competence of someone who had spent 20 years watching people walk into her office at the worst moments of their lives, and she handled me the way I imagined she handled everyone, with efficiency instead of pity, which was, that particular week, exactly the kindness I needed. "You're entitled to everything," she told me, sliding the folder across the desk. "Every note, every test, every communication logged on your account. It sometimes surprises people how much is actually in there." I didn't open it in front of her. I wanted privacy for whatever I was about to read, the same instinct that had kept me composed at that dinner table 3 days earlier. Some things deserve to be absorbed without an audience. I drove to a small park near the hospital, the kind with wooden benches facing a pond that mothers bring toddlers to feed ducks at, and I sat with the folder unopened on my lap for almost 10 minutes before I found the nerve to start. The first several pages were what I expected: the initial blood work, the referral to Dr. Ferris, notes from my first consultation. My hands were steady until I reached the 4th page, a summary dated the same day as my appointment in March, and I read it twice because I was certain, the first time, that I had misunderstood something. The preliminary results were not conclusive of anything aggressive. Dr. Ferris's own notes described the findings as most consistent with a benign hormonal irregularity, further testing recommended to rule out alternative causes, patient anxiety regarding outcome appears disproportionate to current clinical picture. There was no mention anywhere in that initial note of the words Walter had used at our dinner table, no aggressive potential, no language remotely close to the picture he had painted for his mother, his sister, and an untouched pot roast. I turned to the next page, and the next, looking for whatever conversation might have happened between Dr. Ferris and Walter directly, the one that had apparently produced such a different story than the one written in the doctor's own clinical hand. I found it near the back of the folder, a brief phone log, dated the same afternoon, noting that Walter had called requesting results be discussed with him first, and that Dr. Ferris had, reluctantly, provided him with a summary over the phone before my own appointment that same day. There was no record of what exactly Dr. Ferris told him verbally, but there was a record of what she'd written down immediately afterward, in a short addendum note time-stamped 20 minutes before I walked into her office. Advised husband that findings are preliminary and likely benign. Husband seemed to want a more serious framing for family discussion purposes, reiterated caution against premature conclusions. I read that sentence perhaps 6 times. Husband seemed to want a more serious framing. I sat on that bench for a long time after that, watching a mother pull her toddler back from the edge of the pond, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe now as the particular, quiet clarity that comes after a long fog finally lifts. Walter hadn't simply misunderstood a difficult diagnosis and panicked. Walter had taken an uncertain, likely benign finding and deliberately reshaped it into something worse. Worse, specifically, in the version he told his family, the version that painted me as a burden he was reluctantly, nobly considering himself trapped by. I thought about the divorce papers sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about how quickly they'd arrived. 3 days, when I knew from friends who'd been through it that Walter's own lawyer, a meticulous, expensive man named Foster, typically took weeks to draft anything. 3 days meant Walter had started that process before my dinner table diagnosis had even been announced. 3 days meant the divorce hadn't been a reaction to bad news at all. It had been the plan the entire time. The diagnosis, real or exaggerated, had simply been the story he needed to tell his family to make his timing look sympathetic instead of calculated. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A text from a number I didn't recognize, area code local, message brief. "This is Foster's paralegal, Renata. I probably shouldn't be reaching out this way, but there's something in your file I think you're entitled to see before you sign anything." I stared at that message for a long moment before I typed back a single word. When? Because 11 years of careful self-control had at least taught me the value of not asking too many questions before you understood what you were actually being offered. Her name was Yolanda, and she agreed to meet me the following morning at a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough from Walter's office that neither of us had to worry about being seen together. She arrived early, a folder of her own tucked under one arm, and she looked, when I sat down across from her, like a woman who had spent a sleepless night, deciding whether loyalty to her employer outweighed whatever she'd stumbled onto. "I want to say up front," she told me, before I'd even ordered anything, "that I could lose my job for this. I'm telling you that so you understand I'm not doing it lightly." I nodded and waited. I had learned, over the past week, that silence often extracted more honesty than questions did. "Foster started drafting your divorce filing 6 weeks ago," she said. "Not 3 days ago. 6 weeks. I know because I typed the initial intake notes myself." She slid a printed timeline across the table, dates and file names, the kind of quiet, damning paper trail that doesn't require interpretation. Walter came in late January, before any of this medical stuff even started, and told Foster he wanted to move quickly on a divorce, but that he wanted it to look sympathetic. Those were his words. Sympathetic. He said he didn't want to be the villain in the story, especially with his mother, who apparently thinks very highly of you. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a confirmation of a suspicion I'd been circling for days without letting myself land on it fully. "Then in February," Yolanda continued, "there was a change of strategy. Foster's notes mention that Walter had learned you were being referred for some testing, and that he thought, I'm reading this directly, this could work in our favor if framed correctly. I didn't understand what that meant until I saw the actual filing paperwork, which requests an accelerated settlement based on, and I'm quoting the language here, significant caregiving burden and diminished capacity of the respondent." "Diminished capacity," I repeated. The words tasted strange in my mouth, clinical and cold, applied to a body that, according to my own doctor's notes, likely had nothing seriously wrong with it at all. "He used your possible diagnosis to argue for a faster, more favorable settlement," Yolanda said quietly. "The idea being that a judge might move things along more sympathetically, and more importantly, that you might be too overwhelmed, too frightened, too focused on your health to fight the terms closely. I think," she hesitated, glancing down at her coffee, "I think he was hoping you'd just sign whatever was put in front of you." I thought of the dinner table, of the pot roast, of Denise's comment about the silver lining of never having children, and Walter's mother reaching for my hand with an expression I'd mistaken, at the time, for sympathy. I wondered, now, how much of that room had known, or half known, or chosen carefully not to ask too many questions about a story that made their son and brother look like a burdened, reluctant martyr instead of a man executing a plan. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Yolanda, because I needed to understand the shape of what I was being handed before I decided what to do with it. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. "My mother was sick for real, 2 years ago," she said finally, "and my father used almost the exact same playbook, made everyone believe he was the exhausted, devoted husband holding it all together, right up until the divorce was finalized, and everyone found out how much he'd actually been planning behind her back. I watched her sign things she shouldn't have, because she was too tired and too scared to read them closely." She looked up at me. I couldn't watch that happen twice and say nothing. I drove home from that coffee shop with Yolanda's timeline folded carefully in my bag beside Dr. Ferris's file, and for the first time in 11 years, I didn't feel like a woman absorbing a blow. I felt like a woman finally holding the exact shape of the thing that had been done to her, and beginning, quietly, to understand precisely what she was going to do about it. My phone rang before I'd even pulled into my driveway. Foster's office, according to the caller ID. I let it ring twice before I answered, and when I did, the voice on the other end wasn't Foster's paralegal this time. It was Foster himself, and the first thing he said, before I'd even said hello, was, "Renata, I think we need to talk about some irregularities in your file before this goes any further." I let a pause sit on the line before I answered him, the same kind of pause I'd learned, over the last week, tended to make people fill the silence with more truth than they'd originally intended to give. "What kind of irregularities, Mr. Foster?" He cleared his throat, and I could hear, underneath the practiced calm of his voice, the particular unease of a lawyer who suspected his client had put him in a position he hadn't agreed to. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person. There are some elements of the filing I want to revisit before anything moves forward." I told him I'd be at his office within the hour, and I meant it, I no longer had any interest in letting this unfold on anyone else's timeline but my own. I didn't bring a lawyer of my own that day, though I had already called one the previous afternoon, a careful, unhurried woman named Priscilla, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and had listened to my account with the particular quiet of someone doing rapid calculations behind her eyes. I didn't need her in the room yet. I only needed Foster to understand, clearly, what I was holding. I laid it all out on his desk, Dr. Ferris's original notes, describing my results as likely benign. The addendum documenting Walter's specific request for a more serious framing, Yolanda's timeline, 6 weeks of quiet planning dressed up, 3 days before the filing, as a grieving husband's sudden sympathetic decision. And finally, the divorce filing itself, with its careful, damning language about diminished capacity and caregiving burden, built entirely on a diagnosis that didn't yet exist and, as it turned out, never would. Because 2 days later, Dr. Ferris's office called to confirm what her earliest notes had already suggested. Benign. Treatable. Nothing close to what my husband had told an entire dinner table, or what his lawyer had written into a legal filing designed to make a judge move quickly and quietly in his favor. Foster's face, as he read through what I'd brought him, told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd been a willing architect of this plan, or simply an instrument of it. He set the papers down slowly. I wasn't given the full picture, he said, which was, I suspected, as close to an admission as a man in his position was ever going to offer me directly. Then I'd suggest, I said, you give the full picture to whoever ends up reviewing this filing next. I didn't seek revenge in the way Walter's family might have expected, if they'd known enough to expect anything from me at all. I didn't call his mother and unravel the story he'd told her. I didn't need to. Priscilla filed a formal response within the week, attaching Dr. Ferris's actual notes and Yolanda's timeline as exhibits, and a diminished capacity divorce filing, built on a diagnosis that didn't exist, collapsed under its own paperwork almost immediately. Walter's accelerated sympathetic settlement became, instead, a long, thoroughly documented negotiation in which every advantage he had been counting on quietly evaporated, replaced by a judge who read the exhibits with visibly narrowing patience for the husband who'd tried to weaponize his wife's medical uncertainty for a faster payout. His mother found out anyway. Not from me, from the filing itself, which became part of the public record, and which Denise, ironically, was the one who eventually read in full, sitting in a courthouse hallway waiting for a hearing she'd assumed would be simple. I heard, much later, secondhand, the way these things travel, that Walter's mother stopped taking his calls for several months. I don't know if that estrangement lasted. I stopped tracking the details of his life around the same time I stopped needing to. What I kept, in the end, wasn't anger. It was the folder, the original one, the thick manila one Patricia had slid across her desk that first afternoon, and the particular, hard-won knowledge that no one, not a husband, not a doctor's assistant, not a room full of relatives eating a pot roast I hadn't made, gets to decide the story of my own body before I do. I am, these days, considerably harder to underestimate. If her story stayed with you, there are more women like her whose quiet strength deserves to be heard. Subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next.